My name is Mackenzie Thompson. I'm 28 years old. Last Christmas, I baked my grandmother's pecan pie from scratch, wrapped up 7 personalized gifts, drove through a snowstorm to my aunt's house, and when I knocked, she looked me in the eye and said, "We don't want you here." Then she slammed the door in my face while my entire family laughed behind it. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own bloodline, if you've ever knocked on a door thinking it might finally open only to be shut out harder than ever before, you're not alone. This isn't just a story of holiday heartbreak. It's a story of gaslighting, betrayal, and justice. So, before we go any further, hit that like button, subscribe for more real-life revenge stories, and drop a comment if you've ever been ghosted by your own family. Because what you're about to hear is my journey from rejection to redemption, and it gets ugly before it gets empowering. Growing up, I always believed my family was functional. Not perfect, no one's is, but warm. Holiday card worthy. My dad was a quiet civil engineer who spent weekends restoring antique radios. My mom, Karen, worked as a school secretary, always juggling late-night calls from PTA moms and bargain hunting with a military precision. I was the oldest of 3. Then came Connor, the golden child, born with the business acumen of a stockbroker and the empathy of a parking meter. And Amber, the baby girl with a voice like honey and a spine that hadn't quite formed yet. From the outside, we were normal. Inside, we were held together by silence, control, and Laura. Aunt Laura. My mother's older sister. A woman whose smile was sharper than her stilettos, who ran her own real estate firm like a mafia empire. If you crossed her, even at Thanksgiving, you were out socially, financially, emotionally exiled. When my parents divorced, things split literally. My dad moved into a small rented bungalow. I moved with him. Not because I hated my mom, but because he needed someone. He had no one else. That simple act, choosing him, put me on Laura's blacklist for life. At 21, I made a decision from compassion. To them, it was betrayal. After that, everything changed. My calls went unanswered. I was accidentally left out of family group chats. At my cousin's wedding, my name wasn't even on the seating chart. I ate shrimp cocktail standing next to the restroom, while my siblings danced in gold-lit splendor. Every family photo online cropped, every invite lost in the mail, every year. I clung to the hope that maybe next Christmas, they'd remember I existed. I worked hard, graduated with a design degree, launched my freelance business. I sent birthday cards. I mailed gifts. I invited them to my exhibitions. And when no one came, I made excuses for them. They're just busy. They'll come around, maybe next year. Amber would reply to my texts. Sometimes, but always cautiously, like someone sneaking glances over their shoulder. The year before, I'd driven all the way to Laura's for Christmas, only to be told at the door that they were at capacity. "We thought you were staying with your father. There's just no room." That moment should have broken me, but I still hoped. That's how deep familial conditioning runs. We keep knocking on the doors of people who've already deadbolted us out. 2 weeks before Christmas last year, I got a call from my mom. Just hearing her voice made my stomach tighten. "Mackenzie, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we stop this awkwardness. Everyone's coming to Laura's again for Christmas. Maybe you should join us this year." I remember just standing there in my kitchen, holding my phone like it was made of glass. "You want me there?" I asked, carefully. "Of course," she replied, with a laugh that didn't quite reach her voice. "Let's put things behind us." I should have heard the tone. I should have remembered who she was and who she answered to. But instead, I clung to the words I had begged to hear for years. "I'll be there," I whispered. "Thank you." That night, I made a list. Baked Grandma's pecan pie recipe 3 times to get the crust just right. I handpicked books for Connor, crafted a resin ornament with Amber's name engraved, found a lavender-scented diffuser for Mom, and for Aunt Laura, a leather Mont Blanc pen, engraved with 3 small words, "To New Beginnings." I told my best friend Jenna what was happening. She blinked twice. I know you want to believe people change, but Laura Karen. They don't even know how to spell sorry. She called me. I insisted. Maybe this time is different. Or maybe it's the same trick wrapped in a prettier bow. I brushed it off. Maybe she was jaded. Maybe I was naive. But in my heart, I needed to believe that families don't stay broken forever. That some doors, once shut, could open again. I arrive at Aunt Laura's house on the morning of Christmas Eve. The drive was long, but the excitement kept my foot heavy on the gas pedal. Snowflakes began to dot the windshield, and I couldn't help but think how perfect this all seemed. It was a holiday that had become synonymous with rejection. But today would be different. I was wearing a new coat, the red scarf my mother bought me last Christmas, that she insisted I try to be a bit more stylish. I had gone all out. I had packed the gifts with care, just as I always did. And this year, I told myself it would be different. I parked in the driveway. The house was all aglow, its windows sparkling like the fairy tales I'd read as a child. The sound of laughter floated from inside as I approached the front door. For a brief moment, I stopped and held my breath, feeling a mixture of anxiety and anticipation swirling in my chest. But I steadied myself. This was it. This was my family. My chance to reconnect, to be part of something again. I could see myself here, laughing at the dinner table with them, exchanging stories like nothing ever happened. I knocked. The door opened immediately, and there stood Laura, her eyes cold, her smile tight. Her perfectly styled hair glinted under the warm lights from inside. For a moment, it felt like I was back in time, like we were all in the same room again, and I was just another niece visiting her aunt. But something in her posture, the way her lips twitched ever so slightly, made me pause. "Mackenzie," she said, the words slipping out with the familiarity of someone trying to fake sincerity. "I wasn't expecting you today." I blinked. The door was wide open, but something in the air felt thick, suffocating. I felt the cold bite at my skin, the wind whipping through the entryway, trying to make me feel small, and it worked. "Merry Christmas, Aunt Laura," I said, forcing a smile, though my throat felt dry. I stepped forward with the gifts, eager to see the smiles I had imagined in my mind. But Laura didn't move. Her gaze flickered down at the wrapped boxes in my hands, and I saw the faintest roll of her eyes. The smile never reached her eyes. "We've made other plans. Mackenzie," she said, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. "There's no room for you here today." For a moment, my world shattered. It wasn't the usual rejection, not the subtle exclusion I had grown accustomed to. No, this time, it was clear, direct. They didn't want me. Not at all! "What do you mean?" I asked, a bitter laugh escaping me, trying to hold on to some thread of hope. "You said I could come. You invited me." My voice quivered, and I hated it. I hated that I was being weak in front of her, in front of my family. Laura didn't even flinch. She didn't apologize. She didn't even blink. I was wrong. We're at capacity. "It's just not possible," she said, almost too calmly. And before I could respond, she looked over her shoulder, signaling to someone inside. My mother walked into view, but she didn't look at me. Her eyes were lowered, like she didn't want to acknowledge I was there. "Mom," I whispered, but it came out too quiet. She didn't respond. Laura's eyes flickered over to her. Then, with a practiced look of finality, she said, "Go home. Mackenzie, we've got nothing more to say." I couldn't breathe. The cold air that had once been refreshing now felt suffocating. I stood frozen on the doorstep, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. I had spent hours driving to get here. I had fought my own reservations, my fears, just for this moment, and now, nothing. I felt my fingers tighten around the boxes in my hands, the edges digging into my palms, as though the physical pain might distract me from the suffocating ache in my chest. I had become nothing to them, a ghost, But more than that, I felt the sting of betrayal. Every laugh I had once shared with them, every memory I had clung to, now seemed like a lie. A cruel, elaborate joke they'd played on me my entire life. I thought I could trust them. I thought they might have changed. But the truth hit me like a freight train. They had never wanted me. They had never really loved me. And that's when I realized I had nothing left to lose. I turned away from the door and walked down the steps, each step heavier than the last. My heart pounded in my ears, and for a moment I wanted to shout, to scream at the top of my lungs. I wanted to burn everything down, to tell them exactly how they had made me feel. But I didn't. Instead, I kept walking, the snow crunching under my boots, and I felt something cold settle deep in my gut. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The car ride back home felt like a dream. I couldn't focus on the road, couldn't focus on the passing landscape. My mind was buzzing with anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming need for justice. When I got home, I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I sat in my apartment, staring at the pile of gifts I had brought. The pie sat untouched, the wrapping paper and ribbon strewn across the floor like fragments of my shattered expectations. I couldn't help but wonder, why did I keep going back? Why did I keep letting them hurt me? But that thought faded as quickly as it had come. I knew what I had to do now. I had been nothing to them, but I would make them see me. I would make them regret this. They had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let it go unpunished. Not this time. I needed something concrete, something irrefutable. This wasn't just about my hurt feelings anymore. This was about exposing their hypocrisy, their manipulation, their cruelty. I knew what Laura had done to me, what they all had done, but I needed evidence, something that would force them to face the reality of what they had done. I began going through old family records, emails, messages, and then a file caught my eye. It was an old email thread, one that I'd completely forgotten about. It was a conversation between Laura and my mother, discussing a plan to make sure I didn't get any of the family's inheritance when my grandfather passed away. The details were chilling, the cold calculation in their words. They were planning to cut me out for good. I wasn't surprised, but that didn't mean I wasn't furious. I had a choice to make. I could keep my silence, live my life in the shadows of my family's rejection, or I could do something that would make them listen. The choice was clear. The night after I was turned away from Laura's house, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts, anger, and a quiet, persistent voice telling me to do something. I had been rejected countless times, but this time was different. I wasn't going to let them sweep me under the rug any longer. I needed something evidence, something concrete that would make them see me for the first time in years. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about taking back my life. I woke up early the next morning and, with the adrenaline still pumping through my veins, I started going through old family documents. The cluttered drawers in my apartment, once a symbol of my attempt to make this place feel like home, became a battlefield. Files and folders lay scattered across my coffee table, each one holding a piece of the puzzle. Emails, tax returns, old bank statements, everything that could give me leverage. But it wasn't until I opened an old folder labeled Family Matters that I found the bombshell, an email thread between my mother, Laura, and my father that was dated just 2 months before my graduation. The subject line caught my attention immediately: re-inheritance and Mackenzie's future. My heart stopped. I didn't need to read any further to know that it had something to do with me. The email began with my mother's usual passive tone, but as I read, the truth became clear. It's time we make sure Mackenzie doesn't get any of Grandpa's estate. We need to shut her out completely, like we always said we would, if she has any claim to it. We're not going to have a leg to stand on. Laura's response was cold, almost calculating. I've already made arrangements with the lawyers. We just need to make sure she doesn't inherit anything. If she's been cut off from the family long enough, she won't have any legal grounds. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. The words were sharp, cruel. They were talking about me, like I wasn't even there, like I was a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to their carefully crafted life. It was clear now, this was bigger than a single Christmas. This wasn't just about family dynamics or being left out of dinner tables. This was about systematic exclusion, a deliberate attempt to make me invisible. And they had been doing it for years. I couldn't let this go. The betrayal burned in my chest. And I knew I had to act. But how I was just one person against the might of my mother, Laura, and their financial influence. What could I possibly do that would make them listen? The first step was clear. I needed more evidence. If I was going to confront them, I couldn't just show up with an email chain. I needed to show that they had been orchestrating this behind my back for years. I started to dig deeper, going through every document, every scrap of paper that had been left behind. I scoured through tax records, old family investments, anything that might connect Laura and my mother to the plan they had so carefully laid out. I dug into the family estate documents, tracing back to the will that my grandfather had made. Then, I found it. A revised will, one that my grandfather had made just months before he passed away, the same year they had started all their manipulations. The document had a clause I had never seen before in the event of my death. Mackenzie Thompson shall have no claim to my estate, nor will she be entitled to any of my financial holdings or assets. The shock hit me like a slap across the face. This wasn't just exclusion. This was calculated. They had preemptively locked me out of the family legacy, even before I'd ever known what they were planning. By the time I had all the pieces in front of me, I realized something profound. They hadn't just cut me out of their lives. They had decided I didn't matter. I was a ghost to them, a forgotten casualty in their game of power and control. But I wasn't a ghost. I was still here, and I had something they couldn't ignore: the truth. I could feel it, the shift. The moment when everything clicked into place. I wasn't going to be passive anymore. I wasn't going to let them use me as a pawn in their twisted family drama. I was going to make them pay. The plan started to form in my mind, a strategy that would not only expose them, but make them regret every decision they had ever made. I needed to take control, to show them that I mattered, that I was no longer the invisible daughter they had cast aside. The first move was simple. I needed to expose them, to show the world what they had done. I couldn't just tell my side of the story. No, I needed to show everyone the reality of what had been going on behind closed doors. If I could get the documents to the right people, it would be the catalyst I needed to take back my life. The next few days were spent in deep focus. I started planning, mapping out every step. The stakes were high if I did this wrong. Everything could backfire. I had to be smart. Every action needed to be precise, measured. First, I enlisted the help of Jenna, my best friend and the one person who had always believed in me. Jenna had connections, people who worked in media, who knew how to navigate the systems of exposure. She'd helped me during my design exhibitions, so I trusted her implicitly. We began by creating a dossier, a file filled with everything I had found: the email chain, the revised will, the bank records, and the evidence of Laura's manipulation. It was a cold, hard case that couldn't be ignored. But I knew that alone wasn't enough. I needed a bigger audience, something that would force the issue into the light of day. We began to compile a list of journalists, legal experts, and influencers who could help amplify the story. I spent hours crafting emails, explaining the situation in clear, undeniable terms. I needed to paint a picture of my family's betrayal, showing the world exactly what they had done to me and what they were still doing. It was time to act. The stage was set. The first blow would come soon. The day after we sent out the first batch of emails, I received a reply from a well-known investigative journalist named Chris Whitaker. He had worked on stories about corporate fraud, family betrayal, and the kinds of issues that required a deeper look. His response was short, but it felt like the validation I had been waiting for. "This sounds like something we should cover. Let's talk." I couldn't believe it. The walls were finally coming down. I sat down at my desk and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about getting back at them anymore. This was about justice. about standing up for the person I had always been, the person they had tried to bury. But as the days passed, I started to wonder, was I doing this for me? Or was I doing this for everyone who had been hurt by their cruelty, with Chris on board, and the story slowly taking shape? I felt a sense of anticipation build, but I also felt something else, fear. What if they came after me? What if my mother and Laura retaliated in ways I couldn't predict? I had pushed all my chips to the center of the table. And now there was no turning back. The first crack in the family's pristine facade came early. It was the night after I received the email from Chris Whitaker. He had written back, telling me that he was interested in my story. And in the small hours of the morning, when everything felt quiet, almost too quiet, I started writing. I wrote an email, a simple one. It wasn't full of flowery words or anger. It was clear, methodical, and it told the truth. Subject: exposing the truth about my family's betrayal. My name is Mackenzie Thompson. For years, I've been excluded from my family, manipulated out of inheritance, and erased from a legacy that was mine by blood. My family, my mother, my aunt, and others have worked behind closed doors to ensure that I had no claim to any of it. Here is the evidence. I attached everything: the emails, the will, the financial documents, everything that would paint the picture of their manipulation. I hit send. The moment I clicked send, I felt both a rush of relief and the weight of what I had just set in motion. There was no going back now. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone they had trampled on in their pursuit of control. But what came next? The waiting. I woke up the next morning to a whirlwind. Chris had already contacted me. His email was short, but it felt like the start of something much bigger. I've spoken to the editor. We'll be running this story in the next issue. We'll make sure the details are airtight. This will hit hard. I had to sit down. It was finally happening. The reality of it all began to sink in. I had spent so many years being made to feel small, insignificant, but now I was about to become the voice of truth. I wasn't going to be erased anymore. Then came the text from Jenna. Mackenzie, they know. The moment the article hit the press, the ripples began. Social media erupted. The story was shared, posted, and discussed by everyone: friends, strangers, people who had no idea who I even was. But they knew what my family had done, and it wasn't just the betrayal of inheritance. It was the long-term manipulation of someone they should have loved. But while the world began to react, my family, they were silent. At first, then the storm came. It was my mother who called me first. The sound of her voice was like ice, colder than it had ever been. I could feel the anger and panic in her words. Mackenzie, what did you do? Why would you bring this up? Why now? She was furious. The high-pitched desperation in her voice was unmistakable. But it wasn't just anger. It was fear. My mother had always controlled her emotions. But now, she was unraveling. She wasn't mad at me. She was mad at the fact that everything she had worked to protect was falling apart. You know what you've done to this family. I can't believe you would do this. You've destroyed us. The guilt trip was something I had expected. I braced myself. I had seen this before. The manipulation. She tried to make me feel small again, just like she always had. But this time, I didn't back down. I didn't apologize. I didn't even feel the need to defend myself. Mom, this isn't about you. This is about the truth. You've been hiding it for years. I've been hidden for years. I won't be silenced anymore. Her response was cold and clipped. You're going to regret this. Mackenzie, you've made a mistake. I didn't respond. Instead, I hung up the phone and sat there, alone in my apartment, as a storm raged inside me. The next few days were chaos. News outlets picked up the story. The more it spread, the more my family crumbled under the weight of the truth. I wasn't the only one who had been hurt. The community that had been built around my family's wealth and reputation was fragile, and now it was exposed. People began to ask questions. How could someone be so cruel? How could a family turn against their own? In the aftermath, I started getting calls from distant relatives, people who had been kept in the dark for years. They were all shocked, but they were on my side. But nothing prepared me for the phone call from Amber, my baby sister, the one I had once tried to protect from this world. She was quiet, hesitant, but there was a flicker of something in her voice that made my stomach twist. "Mackenzie, I saw it. I saw everything. What you wrote, what happened to us." I could hear the sadness in her voice, the confusion. Amber had always been the one to hold things together, to keep the peace. She had never wanted to pick sides. But now she was forced to face the truth. "I didn't know it was this bad. I didn't know what they were doing to you," she said, her voice breaking. For the first time, I felt like she was finally seeing me, truly seeing me, and it hurt. "Amber, I've been trying to tell you this for years. I've been trying to reach out. They've been controlling you just like they've controlled me. But you have to make a choice. You have to decide who you're going to stand with." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing. And then the words came. "I'm so sorry. I'll stand by you. I'll help you." I didn't know whether to cry or scream. But what I did know was that this was it. Amber was the last piece I needed. Now. We were a team, and together, we would take this fight to the very end. The phone call from Laura came the next morning. Her voice was cold, more controlled than my mother's, but still laced with venom. "You've made a huge mistake. Mackenzie, this is going to ruin you. Do you think you can fight us? You'll lose." I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. I had seen them for what they truly were. They were just weak underneath all that power and manipulation. "No, Laura, you've ruined us. You've been using me as your scapegoat for too long. You don't get to hide behind that mask anymore. Everyone knows now. You're the one who's going to lose." Her silence spoke volumes. I could almost hear her mind scrambling for her next move. But there was nothing she could say. The game had changed. The truth was out. The days following the public revelation felt surreal. I watched as my family slowly, painfully, began to fall apart. Social media exploded with posts about my family's betrayal. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers began to ask questions. My mother, Laura, and everyone who had once hidden behind their wealth and status were now exposed for the world to see. They weren't just family. They were frauds. Manipulators who had sacrificed me on the altar of their own self-interest. The media blitz began, and for the first time in my life, I felt empowered. My story was no longer mine alone. It was everyone's story, the story of someone being ignored, erased, and rejected. But as the world turned their attention to my family's toxic dynamics, there was a nagging sense that this wasn't finished. I wasn't done. I couldn't be. I had taken the first step by exposing them, but now it was time for them to feel the consequences of their actions. The phone calls came pouring in. Some were from journalists. Others, surprisingly, were from people I had never met, distant relatives who had long been kept at arm's length. They expressed their shock and sympathy, but there was always the undertone of something else. They wanted to know the truth. Everyone who had been shut out of the family's tightly controlled empire now had a voice, and they wanted to make sure my family would never get away with what they had done. But then came the call from my mother. I had known this call was coming. I had been waiting for it. Though I wasn't prepared for how it would feel, my mother's voice had never sounded like that before. It wasn't the usual practiced calm, the careful politeness of a woman who was always in control. This time, it was tinged with something I hadn't heard from her in years: fear. "Mackenzie, you need to stop this. You don't know what you're doing. This is going to ruin everything. I can't protect you from this. You've made your point. You've done enough. Please, I'm begging you." I didn't respond immediately. The words hung in the air between us. I could hear the tremor in her voice, the desperation that she couldn't hide anymore. She had always been the one to control the narrative, the one who decided who was in and who was out. And now, I had turned the tables on her. "You've been lying to me for years, Mom. All I ever wanted was to be part of this family. But you You made me feel like I was never good enough. You pushed me away. You erased me. And now, when I finally stand up for myself, you want me to stop." Her silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "You were always a disappointment to me, Mackenzie. You always will be." Her words cut like a blade, but they weren't enough to stop me. Nothing would stop me now. "You never saw me as your daughter. Mom, you saw me as a threat. But you were wrong. I'm not your failure. I'm your reckoning." And with that, I hung up. My chest heaved with the weight of the conversation, but there was no regret, only vindication. Hours later, I received a message from Amber. It was simple, but the words were heavy. "We need to talk." Amber had always been the quieter one in our family, the one who stayed on the sidelines. I had tried to protect her, even when I was the one being shut out. I never wanted her to face the same pain I had gone through, but the moment she sent that message, I knew. She had to be ready to confront everything, just like I had. I called her, and when she picked up, her voice was shaky. "Mackenzie, I saw the article. I saw what they've done to you. I didn't know how bad it was." I could feel the hurt in her words. I had always protected her, and now it was my turn to let her in, to let her see everything. "Amber, it's been happening for years. This wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about them controlling me, using me like a pawn in their game. And I've had enough." There was a long pause before she spoke again. When she did, her voice was filled with a quiet determination I hadn't heard from her before. "I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I don't want to be a part of their lies." And just like that, I knew Amber was finally awake. She was no longer the little sister I needed to protect. She was now my ally, my co-conspirator in the fight for justice. I wasn't alone anymore. The media coverage intensified. The story about my family's manipulation, about how they had tried to bury me in the pursuit of power and money, continued to spread like wildfire. I began receiving calls from lawyers, investigators, and people from my past. Everyone was watching. Everyone wanted to know how far the rabbit hole went. But as my family's secrets were laid bare, so was the tension. I heard from Chris Whitaker the next day. "We've got a story. It's bigger than anyone expected. We're running it nationally next week." The reality of it all hit me again. I wasn't the only one who had been hurt by them. I wasn't the only one whose life had been manipulated. My family's empire of lies was crumbling. And still, they fought back. I received another call from Laura. This time, she wasn't calm. She wasn't the calculating woman I had once feared. This time, she was rattled. Her voice was a mix of anger and desperation. "You're going to regret this. Mackenzie, you think you can destroy everything we've built. You're nothing. You always have been." But her words didn't sting anymore. They felt like the final desperation of someone who had already lost. "You can't control me anymore. Laura, you never could." The family empire they had built on lies, manipulation, and control was falling apart. And as they watched it crumble, so did the illusion they had spent so long creating. The final blow came when I received a call from a lawyer. It was one of the few calls I had been waiting for. He had connected all the dots. My grandfather's estate, the one my mother and Laura had tried so hard to lock me out of, was up for review. With everything exposed, the legal grounds to challenge their actions were rock solid. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. The very system they had tried to use against me was now the tool that would expose them. And when the verdict came in, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The day the verdict came in, the world finally knew the truth. My family's manipulations, their control, their lies, everything was exposed for the world to see. But as I stood there, watching everything unfold, I couldn't help but feel empty. This wasn't what I had imagined. Justice had come. But it had cost me something more than I was willing to admit. I had been fighting for so long. I had forgotten what it felt like to just be free. The story wasn't over, but for now, I had done what I set out to do. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was invisible. The months following the verdict were both a blur and a slow motion unraveling. I had won. My family's carefully curated empire had crumbled, their secrets laid bare for the world to see. The media buzz had died down, the articles and headlines faded into the archives, but the relief I had expected didn't come. At first, I felt empowered. I thought I would feel elated, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But as the silence settled in, as the dust of the battle began to settle, I found myself standing still in the midst of it all, unsure of where to go next. I had torn down the walls my family had built around me, but now I was left in the rubble, and all I could think was, what now? I spent weeks reflecting on everything that had happened, the victories, the betrayals, the quiet moments of realization. But more than anything, I felt the absence of something I hadn't realized I was missing: peace. I had been so focused on the fight, so consumed by the need for justice, that I hadn't taken the time to think about what I would do after, what happens when the battle ends. But the war within yourself is far from over, for the first time in years. I had freedom. My inheritance was now secure. The estate, which had been in dispute for so long, was finally mine. No longer was I fighting for validation or a seat at the table. I had earned my place, but the cost was greater than I had imagined. I went back to my apartment, the place I had carefully built for myself over the years. It was small, but it had become my sanctuary, my escape. But even in that sanctuary, I felt the emptiness of all the things I had lost. Amber had come to visit, and we had a long conversation over coffee. She was adjusting, trying to find her own place in this NA week later. My father called. The line between us had always been a strange one. He had always been distant, caught in his own world. But we had shared a bond, one that was broken only by time and circumstance. "Mackenzie," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I heard about everything. You did what you had to do, but how are you feeling?" His words were genuine, but they came too late. He had always been a man of few words, a man who never showed up when I needed him most. And now, when the world had turned against my family, he was reaching out. "I'm fine, Dad," I said, the words leaving my mouth without conviction. "I'm just figuring things out." He paused for a moment before responding. "You've always been strong, Mackenzie, stronger than I was. I just wish I had done more to protect you. But I never knew how to be a father. Not to you, not to anyone." His apology was long overdue, too long. And yet, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like another layer of guilt added to the pile. I had waited for this moment for years. But when it came, I realized it wasn't the one thing that would heal me. The next few months were a blur of media interviews, lawyer meetings, and public appearances. I became the face of the story, the symbol of someone who had survived the unthinkable. And the world watched. But even as I stood at the center of the storm, I felt like I was slowly losing myself. I had fought for so long against my family, against the system, against the narrative they had built around me. But in the end, I wasn't sure if the fight had been for justice or for something deeper, something that went beyond the superficial. I wanted to find peace. I wanted to let go of the anger, the hurt, the resentment, but every time I tried, I felt the weight of the past pressing down on me. It was then that I made a decision. I wouldn't let the past define me anymore. I would move forward. Not for anyone else, not for my family, but for me. For the first time in years, I was going to reclaim my future. I reached out to Amber. We planned a trip together, a getaway, a break from everything. We were going to take some time away from the chaos, from the headlines, from the family that had torn us apart. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew this: I was no longer bound by the chains of my family's expectations. I was free. As I stood on the edge of a cliff, looking out at the horizon, I realized that the journey had only just begun. The fight for my identity, for my place in the world, was far from over. But now, I was no longer running away. I was moving towards something better. I wasn't sure what the future would bring, but for the first time in my life, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let anyone write my story but me. What happens after the battle ends, after the anger has subsided, after the dust has settled. We all face moments when the fight is over, when the people we've fought against have been exposed, and we're left standing in the ruins of what came before. But it's in those moments that we find the truth about who we are, who we were, and who we want to be. Sometimes, the hardest battle is not against others, but against the ghosts within ourselves. You world where the family no longer had control. She still looked up to me, still saw me as the one who had broken free. But for me, it wasn't that simple. Mackenzie, you did it. You exposed them. You got everything back that they stole from you. But her words, comforting as they were, didn't make the hole inside me feel any smaller. I had fought so long for the right to belong, but now that I had it, I wasn't sure where I belonged anymore. I spent days in my apartment, going through the documents, the old photos, the remnants of a family I had once loved. It wasn't just the material things that haunted me, but the ghosts of my past, the years spent seeking approval from people who had never cared, the time wasted trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. There was a day when I found an old picture of me with my parents, before everything went wrong, in it. I was smiling, the perfect daughter, my mother's arm around me, my father looking on with pride. I hadn't seen that version of myself in so long, but it felt like a stranger. The person in that photo wasn't me. She was a part of me, but she was also a version of myself I had to let go of in order to survive. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I wasn't fighting for a legacy anymore. I was fighting for my own identity. And now that I had won, I needed to figure out who I really was.